What's going on, guys? Dare here with fantasy football advice, coming at you with another draft strategy video. Now these ones are my favorite to make, and in today's video we are going to be discussing the range of outcomes. We'll touch on a couple different players and how you can really use the range of outcomes to help you prepare for your draft. This is also very important for your roster construction heading into the season. You want to set yourself up for the most success possible. Now keep in mind, the beginning part is probably going to benefit the beginners more so than some of you experts out there, but if you stay tuned, we will actually be doing some side-by-side comparisons of players that you all have on your draft board. So we even have stuff that some of you experts can definitely get your analysis fix in for. Now before I do jump into the video, if you are new to the channel, please subscribe. We are posting 5 videos a week every week for the remainder of the off season, and I know how much you all love stats. Well, over 60% of our viewers aren't even subscribed to the channel. It's crazy to think that there are so many of you out there that have not yet subscribed to us. If that actually applies to you, do yourself a favor and subscribe today. Stay up to date with all of our videos throughout the off season. That's enough about that. Let's get right into the video. So let's start off with roster construction. It's one of the most important factors when drafting your fantasy team. It's to help determine a player's range of outcomes. Now when determining these ranges, the terms most often used are ceiling and floor. A player's ceiling refers to the best possible outcome, meaning if everything goes their way, what is the highest stat total that they can accomplish, and a player's floor refers to the worst possible outcome. The floor is going to factor in things like the opportunity, whether that's limited or not, and the player's overall efficiency. Now it's very important that we don't confuse floor with risk. A player can still have a decent floor while still being a risky pick. A player's risk involves many factors such as depth chart concerns, quarterback play, and overall health. For example, Julian Edelman is someone who is known for having a safe floor due to his involvement in the Patriots offense, but is still somewhat of a risky pick just simply due to his age and his injury concerns. So that basically sums it up, and now that we have an understanding of what a ceiling and a floor is, how does that pertain to our pre-draft research? Well, when speaking of ceiling and floor, they're normally preceded with terms like high or low. A high ceiling means they have high upside, a low ceiling means that the player's lacking upside, and the same applies to a floor, but unless you are in the first 2 rounds, draft targets, they don't typically have the combination of a high ceiling and a high floor. Players like Ezekiel Elliott, Antonio Brown, Rob Gronkowski, all of these guys are drafted because they are known that on their bad days, they aren't going to be bad, and on their good days, they're going to be great. Once you start getting into rounds 4, 5, 6, that's when the big question marks really arise, and you end up getting paid for the risk you take. Those high bust rate players, those risky players, usually are the ones that pay off the most, and those safe floor players, those guys are the ones that you really don't like starting, and they really lack that upside. So it's our job to make sure that by draft day, we know every player that's in the draft and have an understanding of what their floor is and what their ceiling is. There are factors that give us the ability to project these ranges, and in order to feel confident in your draft, you must recognize all of them. I think a good way to get started on this is just to take a look at a side-by-side comparison on 2 wide receivers, basically have the same ADP, and that's Brandon Cooks and Golden Tate. Brandon Cooks is currently wide receiver 23, and Golden Tate is currently wide receiver number 25. Now, just an average ADP of wide receiver 24, both of these wide receivers are going to be drafted for your fantasy team. They're going to be drafted to start. And if you're judging strictly off of their ADP, you would assume you can project similar output from these players on a week-to-week basis. But that could not be further from the truth. You have Golden Tate, who has averaged no less than 13 points per game and no more than 14 points per game since 2015. Determining someone like Tate's ranges are completely easy. It's basically as easy as it comes. He has literally had between 90 and 92 receptions for each of the past 3 years. Within 2 receptions for each of the past 3 years. There's really been no other significant changes to this receiving core, excluding Eric Ebron's departure, which, if we're being honest, it's not really going to have an impact to Tate's role at all. There's been no changes to the quarterback position. The defense and run game have not relatively improved either, at least not dramatically. So his range of outcomes is very limited. He is in a bubble. There's no way you can reasonably predict a significant increase or decrease in his production based off of all the other factors around him. It's safe to assume he's going to fall into that wide receiver 2 range and be pretty much consistent on a game-to-game basis, or as consistent as you could ask for in fantasy football, which, as we know, is wildly inconsistent, but Tate is as consistent as inconsistent gets. Now, on the other hand, you have Brandon Cooks. Now, Cooks has a much wider range of outcomes. He's on a completely new team for the 3rd time in 4 years. As a player himself, he's undeniably talented. He's talented enough to be a top 5 wide receiver. And while his route running abilities are on the weaker side, he is really good at what he does, which is run fast and create big play opportunities. He's proven in the past that he has the ability to finish as a wide receiver 1 with recent fantasy finishes of wide receiver 17, wide receiver 11, and wide receiver 20. So under normal circumstances, you would say his range would be between wide receiver 11 or so to wide receiver 20. But unfortunately, there are other factors impacting his range of outcomes, such as the significant downgrade in the quarterback position. We've already told you guys in previous videos that we do expect a down year from Goff all around, but even if he still does perform well overall, it's going to be hard not to regress at the quarterback position when you're going from 2 future Hall of Fame quarterbacks in Tom Brady and Drew Brees to Jared Goff. And the big difference between those 2 quarterbacks and Goff is the significant drop-off in the deep passing game, which actually is Brandon Cook's strong suit. That's really his bread and butter. I'm sure that was definitely why he was brought in, and I think we can see an increase in production in that area from Goff. But from what we've seen up to this point, we know that he is not a superior deep passer. Another thing to factor is the target market share. It's really a big question mark up to this point. With Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp, there's really no judging exactly how many targets he's going to receive. I mean, Watkins himself, who is basically the role he's taking over, only received 70 targets in that role. We definitely expect Cooks to garner more of a market share than Watkins did, considering how much the Rams paid to get him. So for all those unknowns, we have to do our best to give him a range. We already know that he has wide receiver 1 upside, but we've also seen the shortcomings of Jared Goff and his strengths and all of the question marks that come along with the target market share. The fact of the matter is, Cooks is going to end up being the type of player who is going to lose you weeks, but he's also going to win you some as well. Whereas Golden Tate is not going to be giving you that game-breaking upside that Cooks does. So Cooks is probably going to fall into that wide receiver 12 to wide receiver 36 range, somewhere between a top-end wide receiver 2 to a back-end wide receiver 3. He's going to be boom or bust, like I said, but that does not mean that he is not a good player for your team. In fact, there is a team in a roster composition that could really fit Cooks well. When we're talking about Tate, he's not going to give you those high-end wide receiver 1 weeks that Cooks has the ability to, but he is going to provide you those safe and consistent points. Which player is going to be right for your team is going to be based on your roster construction. Both have a place on fantasy rosters, but it really depends on the composition of your team. And this is just a true example of how the range of outcomes are going to help you balance out your roster. So you've heard this term before, balance your roster, balancing draft picks, balance, balance, balance. Now I know you're hearing a lot about it, and we're going to have a separate video that goes more in depth on balancing draft picks, but I will touch on it briefly. So anyone can admit T.Y. Hilton, Josh Gordon, Brandon Cooks, and Marquise Goodwin. They're all high upside wide receivers. Any one of them could have a 100-yard multi-touchdown game. The only problem is they all have a very low floor on a week-to-week basis. They're regarded as boom or bust. This receiving core does have the firepower to beat any team on any given week, but that also means any given week they could completely shut down. If you rely on too many of these players, you're going to regret it. You're going to find yourself losing in these easier matchups, and remember, there is no next week when it comes to the playoffs. It's win or go home, and if you want to gamble on boom bust receivers to produce for 3 straight weeks, you're basically going to be playing with fire. Now there's also the polar opposite effects. If you have receivers like Demaryius Thomas, Golden Tate, Randall Cobb, you may have less fluctuation week to week in the amount of points you score, but your team will be severely lacking that game-breaking upside needed to defeat those stronger teams in your league. And when the playoffs hit, you need to have the combination of both. You need a safe week-to-week baseline with that game-breaking upside. And the only way you can get that done is through balancing your draft picks. So we're going to go ahead and get into how this applies to the later end in your draft. But before we do, we're going to throw out the stat of the day. Congratulations to Nikhil Gupta, who got the question right from yesterday. It was which tight end had the best catch rate of all, and it was Kyle Rudolph. So congratulations to you. For the stat of today, name the only wide receiver who played in all 16 games that was top 10 in drop rate, wide receiver rating, and yards per route run. Now, just to give you a hint, despite posting these amazing statistics, most fantasy owners were disappointed. Now, I hope I didn't give away too much. Put it in the comment section down below and you'll get a shout out. We're also tracking these, so the person who gets the most, we don't know what we're going to do yet, but we'll think of something, so we'll let you know. So put your answer in the comment section. No cheating. This is off the honor system. Alright, so moving on, the later part of the draft. Now, there is a point in the draft where balancing your roster is no longer a priority. This is the part of the draft where we're in the double digits now. By then, your projected starters have already filled out your roster spots. You have some depth on the bench to weather any early injuries or busts. And at this point, you really have the freedom to draft players that you don't really need to produce for your team, at least not right away. But with these picks, you really need to get the highest upside. These players are also known as lottery picks. Some examples of successful ones last year were Devin Funchess, Robbie Anderson, Chris Thompson, Alvin Kamara. One thing they have in common, these guys were all basically afterthoughts. They were not really immediate starters, but kind of fell into a great position after the season started. So when you drafted them, they weren't the players you were excited for, but if you really held on to them, it paid off big. We all know they have a very low success rate, but when they hit, they hit. One other thing about these players is that they could have no floor. The floor could literally be non-existent, and that still makes for a great target. You don't want players who are putting up minimal points on a weekly basis in a safe way. You really want players who could just completely blow up. Or even if they put up no points, it really doesn't matter. You can drop them after 3 or 4 weeks if you can tell it's not panning out. There's going to be more players like this on the waiver wire. But the point is, you want to draft them because the beginning of the season has all these unknown factors that come to fruition. One of your duties as a fantasy owner is to research all these players and know which ones do have the highest upside, and forget about the floor. You don't need immediate or consistent production from your late round picks. Find ones with a realistic path to be a top 20 player at the position. I'll give you guys another example. So you have Sterling Shepard at wide receiver 44, and you have Martavis Bryant, wide receiver 46. Clearly, based off their ADP of wide receiver 45 and 46, they're wide receivers 4 and 5. They're not going to be drafted to be weekly starters, so you shouldn't be forced to start them week 1. So again, we're taking a different approach to this. So let's start with breaking down Giants receiver Sterling Shepard. Last year, everything that could have possibly went right from an opportunity standpoint for Sterling Shepard, it really did. The team suffered major injuries to wide receiver position, losing both Brandon Marshall and Odell Beckham. Not halfway, not late in the season, but really right in the first quarter of the season. Basically leaving the depth chart completely destroyed, and Shepard was the main target through the 20s. And what did he do with that? Well, basically he produced as wide receiver 21 in points per game. I know that he didn't play all the games, but in the games that he did actually play in, he produced as wide receiver 21. It's safe to say that that is his ceiling. Some of the factors that give us the ability to say safely that that is his ceiling is his target market share and his role in the offense. There's no world that Sterling Shepard is going to be the main target while Odell Beckham is healthy. There's actually a stronger chance that he is third in targets behind even Evan Engram. And at the very least, his targets are going to be closer to Engram's than they are to Odell Beckham. And that's not even factoring in how many targets that Saquon Barkley is going to take while he is the receiving back in there. So unless the whole New York Giants bus crashes and all these players get injured again, there's no way he's even going to get to wide receiver 21. So what are you drafting him for? And while these guys are healthy, his role is going to be relatively consistent game to game. That's right, he is going to be the primary slot receiver, granting him a safer floor from other guys in this ADP range, but he's not going to be used much in the red zone, which is definitely going to be limiting his upside. And with all this star power around him, how can you expect him to outshine all of these guys? You just can't. There's only so many targets to go around, and Sterling Shepard seems to be the odd man out. His ceiling for 2018 is basically going to be around wide receiver 30 if everything falls his way. And if you need a player to get you 8 PPR points on a bye week, he's probably your guy, but you shouldn't draft him and be disappointed that he's not developing into an every week starter. You're going to draft him for the player that he is. Now, as for Martavis Bryant, historically, he has performed as wide receiver 21 and 28 in his first 2 seasons in Pittsburgh, and that's behind Antonio Brown. We can't necessarily say that's his ceiling because he was never going to be the main target in that offense. that role is going to always be in Pittsburgh to Antonio Brown, or at least in this AB, Ben Roethlisberger, Le'Veon Bell era. Now Martavis Bryant has since moved on. The target market share is completely different, and he's joining a team where he could compete for a high market share. It's not like he joined a team like the Bengals who have AJ Green, or a team like the Vikings who have Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen. There is a world where Bryant garners a 20% market share, and heading into the season, he will likely start out third on the depth chart, but the only real competition he has is a disappointing Amari Cooper and a washed up Jordy Nelson. If you ask me, my best guess is that Cooper heads over to the slot, leaving Bryant and Nelson on the outside. I think that because Cooper actually received 30 targets from the slot in 2017, and surprisingly, he actually performed well. He was top 20 in yards per route run from the slot position, and even converted one of his 19 receptions to a touchdown, and that wasn't even as good as he was the year before that. In 2016, he was 8th in yards per route run from the slot and converted 3 of his 22 receptions into touchdowns. He doesn't fit the usual mold for these slot receivers, but we're finding success in it nowadays, and they said they want to make Amari Cooper a focal point of this offense. I could really see them putting him in a slot as a check down option. Now, it's a small sample size, but it did show what he can do. If that were to happen that way, that's going to leave a lot of opportunities for Bryant. We haven't seen Jordy Nelson necessarily come back from his injury the right way, and it's pretty clear that Bryant is one of the better deep threat receivers in the NFL. Not only that, he's also the tallest wide receiver, so he could see some red zone opportunities potentially. He's the fastest receiver on the field. I know Amari Cooper and Bryant both show on Player Profiler at least that they run 4.42s, but Brian broke 4.3 during his suspension. So unless Cooper has also gotten faster, Bryant should be the fastest receiver on the field. And don't get me wrong, Derek Carr kind of sucks, but he is known as somewhat of a good deep passer. 8th in 2016 in deep passing and 13th in deep passing in 2017. I wouldn't be surprised if he's in that range again this year. I mean, he has Amari Cooper, Martavis Bryant, and Jordy Nelson, who have all been known as deep threats throughout their career. So if Bryant and Carr are able to get somewhat of a connection going, there is a realm of possibility where Martavis Bryant climbs up the depth chart. This team invested a 3rd round pick into him, knowing all of his issues, knowing all of his baggage, and knowing that he was going to be a free agent after this season is over. Now, don't get us wrong, this isn't a Martavis Bryant hype video whatsoever. There is a very strong chance, I'd say 85% chance that Martavis completely busts and he's basically on the waiver wire in 2 weeks. But there is that small chance that he could turn into a top 20 wide receiver, and there are signs that you can point to that factor that he does have some potential upside. At this point in the draft, that's exactly what you're looking for. You don't want that steady performer, you want the highest upside. So to summarize everything up, never be locked into your rankings. Be flexible with your draft picks, and in the later rounds, shoot for the highest upside. If you notice many of the players on your roster are lacking a high ceiling, draft a high ceiling player. If you notice many of the players on your team are lacking a high floor, draft high floor players. But when you get into the deeper rounds of the draft, player rankings start to become very close. Any news article or OTA update could move a player up or down in the rankings. Even if you have a player ranked as wide receiver 40, but he fits into the need of your team better than a player that you have ranked at wide receiver 38, don't be afraid to draft against your rankings. Take control of your draft. Don't be afraid to call an audible. Nothing is ever black and white on draft day. That's going to do it for this video, guys. Thank you for watching. If you did enjoy this video, hit that like button. If you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. We thank you for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.